Photos, photos, photos. As the 20th century rolled on, people just couldn't get enough of them. In 1930, 1 billion photos were taken around the world. By 1950, that was 2 billion. By 1970, it was around 15 billion. And today, 1.5 trillion photos, some say even more, are taken every year. And 1 billion of those are uploaded to the internet every single day. But the cameras which made photography so popular weren't big expensive models like this 1960s Polaroid. They were far simpler models, box cameras, and that's what we're looking at today.
Box cameras originated in the 1880s, and they were the most popular type of camera for over 60 years. They were cheap to make and designed for a snap shooter who wanted to take photos without having to be a skilled photographer.
Amongst collectors, this particular camera is known as the Ford Model T of family photography. It's a No. 2 Brownie Model A, made by Kodak in 1901. Now, when this camera came out, very few families owned a personal camera. Here's what they used instead. You either had to pose for a formal portrait in front of a giant portrait camera, like this wet plate model from the 1880s. It was a very uncomfortable process. Exposures were long, and to stop your head from moving about during the photo, the photographer would sometimes put your neck in a neck clamp, just to make sure the photo wouldn't be blurred. No wonder very few people smiled. Before a family camera became common, most amateur photographers were enthusiasts, and they bought cameras like this. A dry plate folding model from the turn of the 20th century. They were expensive, they were complicated, and you had to be an expert to know how to use them. And most owners of these cameras would have developed their own photos in a darkroom. This Thornton Pickard model had adjustable shutter speeds and a beautiful build quality. Our model's missing its lens though, if you're wondering what that giant black hole in the front of the camera is. So obviously this camera was a lot simpler because it was a lot cheaper. It was extremely basic, had a single shutter speed, a few exposure controls, and that was it. No flash. If you wanted to take an indoor picture, you had to lift the tab and hold the shutter open.
Here's how it worked. Before taking your first photo, your camera had to be loaded with film. This needed to be done away from direct sunlight, so many snap shooters left this job to their camera shop. Whomever had to load it, the first step was opening the back of the camera. Inside here, you'll notice the Brownie camera name. It seems an unusual name for a camera, but Kodak did have their reasons. They were named after children's characters brought to life by illustrator Palmer Cox. Kodak's Brownie range was the first piece of technology in the world marketed for children, and because the Brownie characters were the Mickey Mouse of their time, this made the camera very popular, although adults loved them as well. To help appeal to children, Kodak even launched a Brownie Camera Club with its own competitions and prizes. Once the back of the camera is open, you pulled out the film holder and attached the spool of film to the top of the holder. Then some film was rolled out to an empty spool on the bottom of a film holder. Not too much though, that would expose the film to light. With the film securely threaded, you then slid the holder back into the camera, crossed your fingers, and hoped you'd done it correctly and were ready to take that first important photograph. Or, like I say, just give it to the camera shop to do. I mean, lots of people did that. Using the Brownie is very different to a modern camera. You held it to your waist and looked down at it to frame your photo. Light hitting a viewfinder lens in the front of the camera is reflected up onto a piece of ground glass, showing you what you were snapping. It's mirror imaged and very small.
To take the photo, you simply move the lever for one photo. You then use this key to wind the film on. And when you did that, you looked into the red window on the back of the camera. And there, you would actually see through onto the film. And as you wound the key, the number of the next film would appear. And then you knew you were ready to take the next photo.
Fast forward over half a century and box cameras were still popular. This Brownie Flash 2 was released in 1957, and at first it looked similar to the 1901 model. The same red window at the back of the camera, The same viewfinders you look down on to frame your photo. But there were changes. Most box cameras now had a close-up lens to take full-body portraits of people, something earlier models could not do. But the most important change is on the other side of the camera. Those holes are flash contacts, and you could use them to fit a flash gun.
Now, flash bulbs which connected to the camera had been around since the late 1920s, but it was only mid-1950s that they really seriously become available for snap shooters. It wasn't an easy process though. So first you took your camera, then you reached into your accessory pouch and you produced the components of your flash. You take the camera and wind the flash holder in. Now, unlike modern cameras whose flash is electronic, these cameras use flash bulbs. Each bulb could only be used once, and after that they had to be ejected using this little red button here, and that would toss the bulb out the flash unit and hopefully, once it had cooled, into a bin. But you get into a bit of trouble that way, because often what would happen is if a flash bulb had only just been fired, it was burning hot, you'd eject it into the waste paper bin and it would set your bin on fire. Happened to a member of my family. Now, this is what the flash unit would have looked like when it was all set up. This large reflector dish here would have given extra light to bounce out onto the subject. This was absolutely a huge advancement for flash photography, because previously, if you want to take a picture indoors, you'd have to set the box camera to a setting where the shutter would be held open, and your subject would have to sit perfectly still for sometimes up to 10 seconds. Not very good for capturing those spontaneous moments. But in the 1930s, a whole new way of making cameras emerged. Plastics. Freed from a basic rectangle, camera manufacturers began quite literally thinking outside the box, and they made designs like this one, the 1952 Kodak Brownie 127, a more ergonomical shape for the hands, and crucially, a more modern eye-level viewfinder. Box cameras were waning, and the last one was made in the early 1960s. But history would be so much poorer without them. Think about all of the pictures in your own personal family album, all the pictures that we see online, those glimpses into the past, not taken by an official photographer, not even necessarily taken of an event which was important at the time. But as the decades roll on, it becomes a valued glimpse into the past. And without the simple box camera, most of those moments would never have even been taken. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed learning more about these early cameras, and do stay tuned as we have more MAVtech videos coming soon. Thank you.